Sean Bell is a military analyst and a retired Air Vice Marshal. He joins us from London for much more on this. Thank you very much, sir, for being here on Al Jazeera. If we can begin with Macron's comments about sending NATO or European troops to Ukraine. Obviously, severe backlash against that idea from many leaders in Europe. What do you think Macron was actually trying to do by floating this idea in the first place?
Yeah, good evening, Tom. I think you've got to set into context that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if you wind the clock back a year ago, there was a sort of voice of hope. President Zelenskyy thought that by securing the support of the West, the spring offensive would sweep Russia out and that he'd be looking in a much better position by this stage this year. The harsh reality is that despite a lot of Western support, the front lines didn't move very much. And frankly, the West is now struggling to work out how best to support Ukraine. The EU has agreed a fairly substantial slug of money to support, but very little weapons in that package, whereas the US is waiting for $60 billion of support for Ukraine. And there's a huge chunk of that that's around military capability. And it's not weapons that Ukraine needs at the moment, not pledges of money. And it does look unlikely that that money is going to flow from America anytime soon. So I think what Macron was doing was just showing how this is a threat on European soil. What else can be done?
Indeed. You talked about the spring offensive, but what's really gone wrong here with Ukraine? Why have they been stalled? I mean, recently they've just been forced out of Divka. I mean, how worried is Europe, or should Europe be, about the lack of progress right now?
I think it should be very worried. I mean, bluntly, the one thing that Ukraine can't be drawn into is a war of attrition. That normally favours the bigger side, and Russia is the bigger side. The one advantage that the West has given Ukraine is the precision strike weapons, high-tech weapons that have been no match. They provided Ukraine with an asymmetric advantage. The trouble is there are limited supplies of those. The West has largely emptied its cupboards of those weapons. You can't nip down to the local supermarket and buy more. So unless the West spins up its defense industrial base and actually creates a new slug of high-tech weapons, things are looking pretty bleak. And I think we're seeing that on the battlefields, even though it's winter, even though Russia's suffering massive casualties, it is moving forward on the battlefield. And that's a really real worry for the West.
Yeah, you touched on this a little earlier, but we've seen that the United States Republicans have really started to push back against Biden's continuing to try and send billions in military aid to Ukraine. What happens if that flow of weapons is cut off? What will it do for Ukraine's offensive, especially in the east?
Well, bluntly, it will struggle. I mean, Russia's been, both sides, let's be clear, both sides, Russia and Ukraine, are struggling for weapons. But Russia's gone to North Korea. It's got 1 million rounds of ammunition from there. It's gone to Iran, got lots of weapons. And also, Russia's spun up its defense industrial base, funded by its oil revenue, to generate lots of weapons. The trouble is Ukraine hasn't got that defense industrial base. Russia attacks it whenever it tries to generate it. So it's utterly reliant on the flow of Western weapons. Now, it looks unlikely that America is going to continue to fund this. And therefore, unless the West spins up its defense industrial base, World War II, we have factories producing Spitfires, factories producing armaments. They haven't escalated our industry in the West to that level. Unless we do, I have to say the future looks pretty bleak. And I think that's being felt more by those nations that are situated near to Ukraine, because they're worried that if Russia takes Ukraine, who will be next?
It's all well and good, I guess, for countries like Finland and Sweden to join NATO. But I guess unless their capacity for producing weapons actually does ramp up, nothing is really going to happen here that is good for Ukraine. Why do you think that production hasn't stepped up so far?
Well, the trouble is, I think right at the start of this conflict, the West, including the US, was worried that Russia's invasion might portend a much deeper worry from Europe. Let's face it, 2 world wars have emanated from a country sort of expanding its borders. But what's actually happened now is that Russia has lost a lot, 300,000 of its soldiers, 2,000 main battle tanks. It has had a severely bloody nose from its push into Ukraine. And whilst it still presents a threat to Ukraine, it probably doesn't present a threat to the rest of Europe. As a result, America is going America first. Europe, who has been using NATO as this protective umbrella, but only 11 of the nations in NATO actually pay their way. The rest of the 31 do not. And this is a real wake-up call, I think, for Europe. This is a conflict on Europe's borders, and therefore, what is Europe doing to step up? And I think that's another reason why America, particularly led by presidential candidate Trump, is looking and saying, come on, Europe, step up to the plate. If you're serious about this, you need to start finding ways to address it. And I think that's why, full circle, why Macron wasn't wanting to put Western troops on the ground, but he is saying we've got to do something. And it might be things like a no-fly zone. It might be other ways that the West can help. But bluntly, Ukraine needs weapons, and it needs them now.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. We really do appreciate it. We'll have to leave it there. That's Sean Bell, military analyst and retired Air Vice Marshal. Thank you so much.